Our second major category of tissues are the connective tissues, which are the most diverse, abundant, and widely distributed tissues. Their function is to support, protect, and bind organs. So we have several different types we're going to look at, but all connective tissues share a common origin. So they're derived from an embryonic connective tissue that's called mesenchyme. So mesenchyme is just the first type of connective tissue to develop in an embryo, and it is the tissue from which all other connective tissues are formed. So during the development process, remember all the connective tissues are derived from the mesenchyme. So the mesenchyme begins to differentiate or specialize in the developing fetus into the connective tissues that we find in the adult body. Even though they develop from the same embryonic mesenchyme, all connective tissues are vascular, but the different types have different amounts of vascularity. Now remember, vascularity refers to the blood supply. So we have some that are very vascular, such as our areolar connective tissues, to those that have a very poor blood supply, such as dense regular connective tissue, to completely avascular, no blood supply, in our mature cartilage tissue. And connective tissue exhibits a range of ability to undergo mitosis and regenerate itself. Now we'll look at certain connective tissues like bone and blood that reproduce very easily, constantly regenerating and making new tissues. But as I just mentioned, cartilage, with that lack of blood supply, well, obviously they're not going to be able to regenerate and make new cells. Because this is such a diverse group of tissues, they perform a wide variety of functions in the body, and that includes physical protection, support, structural framework, binding structures together, holding things in place, storage, transport, immune protection. So we're going to look at all of these functions as we look at individual types of connective tissues. But regardless, all connective tissues have three basic components. Those components are cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. The ground substance and the protein fibers form the extracellular matrix. Okay, now the types of proteins and the types of cells are going to vary based on the tissue type, where it's located, and what its job is, as does the extracellular matrix and the protein fibers. When we think about the cells that are found in connective tissue, well, again, it's going to vary based on the tissue. Adipose tissue or fat, well, what's it going to have? A lot of fat cells. We call those adipocytes. Cartilage is a connective tissue. What type of cells? Well, cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. So, obviously, cartilage connective tissue has a lot of cartilage cells. And we're going to look again at each of these as we go through them. But there are some things about these tissues. So, unlike what we saw with epithelial tissues where the cells form junctions and sheets and layers of cells, connective tissue cells are usually not in contact with each other. They're just sort of randomly scattered throughout the tissue. We have two primary types of cells that we have in connective tissue, resident and wandering. Well, think about that. Resident, you live somewhere, you stay there. Wandering, you go from one place to another. So we're going to examine those as well. The resident cells in connective tissues stay in the tissue, so they're permanently housed in that connective tissue. What do? Well, they support, maintain, and help to repair the extracellular matrix. There are several different types of these that stay in place. They're resident cells. These include fibroblast. So fibra means fiber. Blast, I want you to think of that as a term that roughly means build. Okay, so fibroblasts build fibers. They produce the fibers that we find in the extracellular matrix. Adipose tissue, fat cells. Well, they stay in place in the fat tissue. Your mesenchymal cells are those stem cells that are constantly going to replace old, damaged, worn out cells. And then we have something called fixed macrophages. All right, macro, what does it mean? Big. Phage, eat, chomp, chomp, chomp. Okay, so your fixed macrophages are actually derived from cells called monocytes that are one of your white blood cells. Leuco means white, cyte means cell. So your fixed macrophages are leukocytes that are scattered throughout the matrix of these tissues. So what do? Well, what does their name tell you? They eat. They phagocytize. That means to eat damaged cells and pathogens, things that can cause illness. Another thing that they do is to release chemicals that are going to stimulate and attract other cells into that particular area when there's damage. So they stimulate the immune system. Basically, they're waving flags by releasing these chemicals. Hey guys, come over here and help me clean this up. And the second type of cell, big category, resident or wandering. Resident stays, wandering roams around. So they're continuously moving through the connective tissue. Most of the time, these are going to be components of the immune system other than those big resident macrophages. They can also help to repair damaged extracellular matrix. And these are primarily, as I mentioned, your leukocytes, your white blood cells. So they're out there to roam around and find things that can cause you harm. And then what do? Work to destroy it. The protein fibers in connective tissue serve to strengthen and support the tissue. We have three categories of these. Your collagen fibers are sort of cable-like. They're long protein fibers that are very strong, but they're flexible and resist stretching. So these fibers are stronger than a steel cable of the same diameter. That's pretty amazing, right? Yeah, the human body is pretty amazing. So collagen fibers comprise about 25% of your body's proteins. Collagen fibers are numerous in structures like tendons and ligaments. Think about that, tendons and ligaments, attaching things together. And we'll talk more about those when we get to them. But if you're going to have something attached to something else and you're going to be pulling on it, you want something very strong holding it in place. So the collagen fibers we find in our tendons and ligaments provide that service for us. Reticular fibers are sort of like collagen fibers, but they're thinner, so they're much smaller in diameter. Very often they're branched and they form interwoven networks of reticular fibers. They're tough, but they're flexible. So we find these a lot in the stroma, and that's really just the connective tissue scaffolding of squishy organs like the lymph node, the spleen, or the liver. And then our third category of fibers are the elastic fibers. I bet you can figure that one out. Elastic, stretch and recoil, just like a rubber band. Now, we find a lot of these in tissues that undergo a lot of stretch, such as your skin, your arteries, your lungs. So the elastic fibers allow them to stretch and then return back to their normal shape. A disorder associated with connective tissues, and specifically the collagen fibers, is scurvy. So vitamin C is required to produce collagen. So if you have a diet that is deficient in vitamin C, then you're not producing enough collagen fibers. Now remember, the collagen fibers are those strong ones, right? So what happens? Well, you have weakness, your gums begin to ulcerate and bleed, sometimes your teeth fall out. Hemorrhaging can result, abnormal bone growth, and capillaries that rupture very easily, leading to blood leaking out of those inside the body. Now, this was more common back in the early 19th century, especially with sailors who were on long sea voyages, and of course, you can't grow citrus trees out on the ocean, right? So what happened? Their diet was lacking in vitamin C, and the sailors soon started developing this, but they found out very quickly that by eating foods, such as citrus foods that are very rich in vitamin C, that they could prevent the development of this disorder. So this is the reason, if you've ever wondered why sailors are sometimes called limeys, it's because they consumed lots of citrus food, including limes. So what do? Treat it with foods or supplements that have high levels of vitamin C. Another disease that's mentioned in your book is Marfan syndrome. It is a genetic disorder associated with connective tissues that causes skeletal, cardiovascular, and vision abnormalities. So it's an abnormal gene on chromosome 15. So patients that have Marfan tend to have really long digits, fingers, toes, upper and lower limbs. Sometimes malformation of the thoracic cap or the thoracic cage and the vertebral column. Excessive growth of ribs, joints that are easily dislocated, and that's because the tendons, the ligaments, and the joint capsules are very weak. The cardiovascular problems include weak blood vessels such as the aorta, which is the main artery that carries blood out of the heart, and the valves within the heart. The vision disorders develop because of some of the ligaments that help hold the lens in place. So Marfan syndrome range from very mild to quite severe. In the severe cases, the individuals usually are going to die due to something cardiovascular related before the age of 50. However, those that have the much milder case, and if they are lucky enough to receive an early diagnosis, can typically manage this and have a normal lifespan.